hurricane has just passed by my house yesterday. The whole yard is like a lake, and the power has been going on and off. But if it holds, I wanted to do a video today, an English version of a message I did a couple weeks ago. You know, I've been teaching through the book of Genesis at the Spanish-speaking church Pan de Vida, and I like to share what I do there in Spanish in English later on. When I teach through Genesis, you know, I have a different sort of perspective. I'm a teacher type, right? I'm not just a preacher. So for me, when I start off with the first chapters of Genesis, I got to deal with scientific things like creation, the Big Bang Theory, you know, how old is the earth, things like that. And that's why today I also feel that I have to talk about the subject of evolution, because it's huge in our society today. Basically, every young person is taught evolution as the only explanation for the origin of life and for the development of life on this planet. I mean, that's what all your kids are taught. That's what everybody's taught. That's what the majority of scientists would say they believe. So I feel like when you teach through the book of Genesis, you can't just give the biblical teaching. You have to talk about issues that relate to it. So like, I want to read a few verses to you from Genesis chapter 1, and then we'll get into the teaching. Like in chapter 1, verse 11, God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds. And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good." Then you drop down to verse 20, the same chapter. "And God said, let the water teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the sky." So he created all the plants and vegetations, and then creatures of the sea and birds and so forth. So God created the great creatures of the sea and every living and moving thing with which the water teems, according to their kinds, species, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and increase in number, and fill the water in the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth." Then verse 24, "And God said, let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, livestock, creatures that move along the ground, and wild animals, each according to its kind. And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds." In other words, each one was a specific species. There was no crossover of the species. "And God saw that it was good. And then God said, let us make man in our image, in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the livestock, over all the earth, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So in these verses, you see that God created life, all sorts of life, each in its own species, each pretty much, you know, there was a difference in time, a couple of days there and so on, the time periods spoken of in Genesis. But God created all the different species uniquely on their own, each one capable of reproducing. And last of all, he created man. And I like Genesis 2:7. It says he formed him of the dust of the earth, so that we're you know, earthly. But he breathed into us the breath of life, or the spirit, nefesh chaya. He breathed into us. And so he gave us life. So there's a verse in Acts that says God is the author of life. He's the creator of life. That's the point. And I like this one scientist I'm going to mention later on, named James Tour. And he says that scientists do not know what life is. We can't really explain what it is. I remember seeing my father when he passed, and he was lying in that coffin. He weighed the same. He was the same measurements of, you know, his body, but he wasn't there. What was there? What left? What is the life that exists in us, and what causes it? Well, we understand. God does. No human being can even understand it, much less create it. But nowadays, a lot of people believe something very different. Even my neighbor next door, he and I had a discussion, and he said, "Oh no, Warren, scientists have created life in laboratories." And many people believe that today. They think that scientists have created life. James Tour says nonsense. No, they haven't. And you need to know that. But anyway, many believe in that life kind of arose spontaneously from nothing, from inert matter, or that it has always existed, or that it sort of created itself. Kind of the majority opinion of Western society, civilization today, is that life is the result of sort of an accident of chemistry on the primitive Earth. You know, there was this pond or something in which it was heated up by volcanic activity under the ground, or maybe lightning struck it, or cosmic rays or something. And so the basic building blocks of life, the chemical building blocks, sort of came together by accident, and then they just continued this process of development. They've done surveys in Europe and North America, and a whole lot of young people today say that they kind of have discounted faith in God and have discounted the Bible because it talks about God creating life and so on. And they believe science has shown that life happened by itself, accidentally. And of course, you know where this came from. It came from Charles Darwin. He's the one who originally proposed the theory of natural selection and so forth in his book, The Origin of Species, in 1859. And so that theory of evolution that Darwin first put forth has been tweaked and developed over the 161 years or so since then. And it is the basis, it's kind of the most accepted view of how life came about. And that theory of evolution is the foundation of materialistic naturalism. It's what enables them to believe as they do. It's the foundation of atheism, communism, secular humanism, because you got to have that belief in place of belief in God in any of those systems. And systems of thought, ideologies, worldviews, right? You have to have some other alternate explanation for life rather than God, because they don't like the concept of God. And so they look to this as the alternative. Well, anyone who doesn't believe in this, in evolution, is today pretty much considered unscientific and ignorant, actually to be pitied. You're thought of as kind of a nut. Like, oh, you don't believe in evolution? You're kind of a nut. And there are even many famous Christians who believe that God used this process of natural selection to create and develop life on the earth. The famous director of the National Health Institutes, Francis Collins, who was also the director of the Human Genome Project. He's very prominent, especially in these days of the coronavirus and all that. You see him on TV frequently. He believes God probably used the process of evolution to develop life. And various Roman Catholic popes have said that possibly evolution and the science of it and so forth is compatible with the biblical account. Pope Pius XII wrote about this in the 50s and said maybe evolution is compatible with the Bible. And then other popes, Pope John Paul, he wrote about it and said that it could very well be that, he said that new discoveries indicate that it could very well be that man is not the immediate creation of God, but rather the product of a sort of gradual process of evolution, so that his physical body developed through evolution over millions of years perhaps, or thousands of years at least. And then at a certain point when the body part had evolved to a certain level, then God infused into man a soul. And so that's what Pope John Paul II proposed, right? It's kind of a way of being compatible with this scientific theory that so many people believe is absolutely the truth. The current Pope, Francis, has also expressed similar beliefs, and that's why I wanted to bring this message to you. I want to deal with this theory because I believe that as Christians, we've got to understand the ramifications of this theory, and we need to think deeply about this and understand what we as Bible believers should think about it, and how to kind of deal with it, how to present our side. I mean, look, it's taught to millions and millions of people in all the schools, and it has had quite an impact on the faith of people, or the faith of millions, really. First, let me give you a few definitions. Evolution itself just means a process of formation or development, right? So we all believe in evolution in that sense. Things evolve. Societies evolve. Companies evolve in how they do things and so forth. People's ways of thinking evolve. Public education has evolved. The automobile has evolved. Everybody accepts that sense of the word evolution. And then also, I think everybody has to accept the evolution in the sense of small, gradual changes that take place in living things. That's one of the things that first got Darwin's attention when he was in the Galapagos Islands was the changes that he saw in the beaks of these little birds, these finches there on the island, that when it was dry, the beaks became narrower so they could penetrate deeper into certain plants to get seeds out. And when it was more rainy, their beaks became thicker, I think. I think's how it went. It might be the opposite. But anyway, he saw these changes in the beaks, and nobody denies that. Changes happen to living things. They adapt to their environment. The way I understand it, every single breed of dog that we have today was bred from wolves. They all, originally, there were only wolves, and that's sort of an animal. Humans that sort of captured them, domesticated them, and over years of time of breeding them, they brought about all the different species that we have today, from Chihuahuas to Great Danes. And the same is true of cattle and horses. You see different kinds of them, and it's because humans have done the selecting, not nature, not natural selection, but human selective breeding and so forth. No one denies that kind of evolution. And that's called microevolution, very small changes. That's not what I want to talk about in this teaching. What I want to talk about today is macroevolution. And some have termed this abiogenesis. And abiogenesis is life, the beginning of life from non-life, right? It's the idea that life in general arose out of inert materials. In other words, just chemicals in some primordial soup, as they call it, in some pond or something. The basic building blocks of life, the molecules that form RNA, DNA, those kinds of things, actually were lying sort of dormant in a pond somewhere or whatever. And as I said, either with heat from volcanic activity, subterranean activity, or maybe a meteorite or whatever, something sort of triggered that these molecules came together accidentally. And then once that happened, and the very first living sort of something, I don't know what you want to even call it, not even a cell, just living molecules, the basic building blocks of life on a molecular level, they somehow continued for some time, and then other things would strike them, ultraviolet rays or whatever, and gradually these things morphed and changed and evolved into all the species that we have today. So basically all life came from a beginning form of life and branched out. And they call that the tree of life. It went from one thing like a trunk and then spread out into all the branches. And even human beings, we came out of that process. Now, what was the mechanism that caused it? Basically, it's simply chance. And it's most probably all caused by some sort of mutation, chance mutation. There was no directing force that caused life to branch out and to become what it became and to evolve and so forth, but rather little things happen to these molecules of life so that, say a ray struck the molecule and separated off a certain part of it. And if that part that was really needed, the organism died, right? But sometimes by chance, over billions of years, sometimes these kinds of mutations would produce some sort of effect that was positive, that would lead to a greater chance of survivability of the organism. And so in that case, such organisms would then reproduce with that same genetic characteristic. And over billions of years, these things progressed and became all the different creatures that we have. So in a sense, nature selected the survivors. And so that's called natural selection. And it's not like really nature is something or a personality, right? But it's just that through accidents, nature selected these things. There's natural selection. And the only mechanism is accidental mutation. So you have what's called the survival of the fittest. They're the ones that progress. And you have natural selection. And so with this theory, when you look at things and they seem like they're designed, what you have to keep in mind, according to biologist Richard Dawkins, is that that's just an illusion. You think that they're designed that way, but what actually happened is through this process of accidental changes, they became that way, and it looks like they're designed, but they just, the fittest survived, so they look like they were designed that way, but they're not. That's an illusion. The truth is that just billions of little tiny accidents or mutations caused everything to be as it is today. What I understand is that when Darwin originally wrote that book and released it in 1859, it wasn't just absolutely the greatest theory ever written so that everybody just accepted it because of its scientific truth or because it was so well formulated. It was actually controversial even among scientists. But what happened that caused it to be generally accepted in many cases was that there were many scientists who were uncomfortable with the notion of God and they were looking for another way to explain things, and Darwin sort of offered them this alternative way of explaining things. One famous example is Thomas Huxley. And he wrote about this, and he actually was quite honest. He felt that the concept of God was repugnant, repulsive. In those years, they kind of resented the fact that the church had kind of dominated life in Europe for 1,000 years. So you can understand that. They kind of hated it. It was like the church is always over you, they're correcting you, they're judging you, and so on. So a lot of these free thinkers wanted to be just free from all that. And Huxley's one. He wrote that he actually was very glad to discover Darwin's theory. He wished he'd come up with it himself. He said that it provided another way of looking at things so you didn't have to believe in God. I would say that kind of the root of it all is rebellion against God. Just like the French Revolution was kind of a rebellion against God, I would say rebellion is the root of why evolution was so widely accepted. Psalm 2 says that the people of the earth said, they raged against God and against his anointed, and they said, we will break his bonds over us. We'll, get free from his control over us. And so I think that's what kind of is at the root of this. Of course, the psalm there goes on to say, but God will laugh at them for this. You can't escape reality. And anyway, that's what I kind of think is the root of why a lot of people like the theory of evolution. But I don't want to try to refute it based on that. I would like to present some things that I've read a lot of books over the years, and I just want to share with you some of the main points. I just read my most recent book was Return of the God Hypothesis by Stephen Meyer. That's a really good book, somewhat technical, but it really explains 3 primary discoveries in the last 100 years or so that have really challenged this theory of evolution as the main theory as the best explanation, the best hypothesis for where life comes from. If you can handle the technical part, I recommend the book to you, Return of the God Hypothesis. I also read quite a few books from a guy named A.E. Wilder Smith, whom I respected a lot. I would hear him. He'd go to Calvary Chapels a lot and speak. He's dead now, but the man had not 1, not 2, but 3 PhDs. He's an Englishman. And his PhDs were in organic chemistry and pharmacology. And then this other guy I really want to recommend, again, it's very technical, but if you can handle it, check out Dr. James Tour. He did a whole 13 video series on abiogenesis. And man, it's really, I got the gist of it. I never was that good at chemistry in school, but I got the gist of it from him. And boy, I really highly recommend it if you can handle it. The guy's a professor of chemistry, materials science, and nanoengineering, whatever that is, as well as computer science at Rice University. But he really, in my view, explains in that series why what's been so widely accepted for so many years is really not at all scientifically reasonable, but rather pretty ridiculous. It's just contrary to all the laws of chemistry. So let me try to explain that in the few minutes that I have left. The main things that I think we need to keep in mind in considering evolution. First of all, as I said, nobody really even understands what life is at all to begin with. What is that spark of life, right? But then, in addition, the molecules of life, DNA in particular, is a very large molecule and it's very complicated. And it just doesn't come together naturally as people used to propose. It just doesn't happen that, a chance lightning strike or ultraviolet or heat or something makes the chemicals join together. James Stewart talks about that. He says, look, these things don't form by themselves naturally. They don't want to form. They bounce apart. They're not, you just wouldn't find them in a primordial soup. And they just wouldn't join together. When scientists say they've created life in the laboratory, what a few guys did is they, under very carefully controlled circumstances, they were able to make certain molecules bond together. Just the most basic building blocks. But they did it through using intelligence and creating a laboratory and the right pressure and the right chemicals and exactly the right percentages and so forth, which shows that it can't be done without the guidance of something intelligent. And James Stewart says, since the early experiments where they first did a little of the most basic building blocks, they've made no progress at all since the 60s. And so that's the thing. People don't understand. When Darwin wrote his book, they didn't know much. They didn't know any of this stuff. But later discoveries in science have shown the absolute ridiculosity, if that's a word, how ridiculous it is to propose that these things came together by themselves. Even Sir Frederick Hoyle, who was an atheist physicist and writer, said it this way: the possibility that higher life forms have arisen through evolutionary processes is comparable to the possibility that a tornado passing through a junkyard could assemble a Boeing 747 from the materials contained within it. Can you imagine? A tornado goes through a junkyard and wow, look what happened. This 747 came out. See, 747 is incredibly complicated, right? It requires incredible ingenuity and engineering to create such a thing. Well, what scientists now, like James Stewart and others, are saying is that life is actually more complicated than a 747. And so it cannot come together by chance. As I said, when Darwin wrote his book, they didn't have electron microscopes. They didn't know all these things. They thought a cell was like just a little blob of protoplasm. Nowadays, we understand that even the most simple, in quotations, the simplest cell is extremely complicated. Even the cell wall of each cell has the ability to discern and allow certain molecules to pass in and certain molecules it blocks. And there are these little molecular machines, how else can you describe them, within each cell that carry out all these different functions. And so these things are extremely complicated, even a single cell. And the point is, it just can't happen. Not by chance. It requires intelligence and direction. And of course, DNA. Even Bill Gates said DNA is like a computer program, but it's far more advanced than anything man has ever come up with. I like some book, I can't remember, the guy said, they have this SETI program, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and they have these radio telescopes, and they're trying to search the heavens to find signs of intelligent life. And I think it was A.E. Wilder-Smith, he said, what you should do is look through a microscope and you'll see signs of intelligent life in every single cell of every single living thing, because there's this incredibly complicated code there in DNA, and there ain't no such thing. Whoops, my phone is sending me texts. There ain't no such thing as a code or as an information system that happens by chance. Whenever you see a code, anything that communicates a message, there's intelligence behind it, right? If you see a book, you don't say, wow, the laws of chemistry caused ink to form these little blots on this paper, and it actually communicates a message here. Nah. The book was printed by a company that prints books, a publisher. And they had the words there because an author wrote it. That's just the way it is. We understand this. Everybody knows. When you look at Mount Rushmore, you don't say, look at that. The wind and the rain here in this particular state so struck the rocks that it caused those faces, which just happened to look like presidents of the United States. It caused them to form there in the rocks. No, you know that was shaped by intelligence and human craft. And so that's the thing. That's one of the biggest things that refutes evolution. There's just not enough time in the world for billions and billions of years, even with billions and billions of years, with the little changes that have to happen. There's so many changes that would have to happen. There's not enough time in the world. And what we see is far too complex to have happened by chance. Unless you have a prejudice against God, see? If you're biased and you don't do science, with an open mind, then you can't accept what's all around us. People like us who are simpler, we look around and we say, hey man, this is complicated. Somebody had to make it, right? Did you know even Darwin himself said that if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous, successive, slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. And so he said that 161 years ago. Well, if you're honest, his theory has absolutely broken down because we see all this complexity. One guy, Dr. Michael Behe, wrote a whole book about this bacterial flagellar motor that he discovered that had some 40 parts to it. 40 parts. It's like a little outboard motor, microscopic. And you see, every one of the 40 parts has to be there at the same time or the thing doesn't work. You can't evolve one part over millions of years and then later another part and then another part. The creature doesn't survive. It has to all be together. And so the discoveries of science have shown that the theory of evolution, everything happening by natural selection, by chance, by mutation, just simply isn't possible. It can't work. It's a bad theory. It doesn't explain what we see, the complexity that we see. By the way, nobody's ever mentioned this in any book I've read, but I've thought about it. How could you evolve male and female? I mean, it seems like to me a male body is so complicated. It'd take millions and millions and billions of years to evolve a body like a human being has. But then how would you evolve the female at the same time with all the parts that correspond so that you could reproduce? It has to happen together. You can't have one for billions of years and then later you get the other. You have to have both. How'd that happen? It just doesn't make sense. So it just doesn't fit reality, the theory of evolution. And by the way, another thing, the main mechanism is supposed to be mutation. Well, as somebody said, if you take let's say a digital recording of Beethoven and you bombard it with electric shocks or something, hit it with some kind of rays, it doesn't mutate into Mozart. If I take a computer and I just sort of jab at it with a screwdriver, and I say, oh, I'll just unplug this wire randomly. Any kind of random thing that happens to a highly refined and technical and designed piece of equipment, it's not going to be good. It's going to be negative. So mutations just simply do not produce the highly developed life that we see today. Just to mention a couple other things, Darwin, as I said at the beginning, imagined this sort of a tree of life where everything sort of started with one life form and that evolved into all the branches we see today. But he himself recognized what's called the Cambrian explosion, which was a certain strata in the earth where they discovered all sorts of life forms sort of coming into existence at the same time. So instead of a sort of a tree with one trunk, someone has described it as it's more like a lawn with thousands of little plants. That's what we see in the fossil record. And so that refutes his theory. What I understand is that Darwin himself knew that was a problem, but he thought later discoveries would kind of help him explain this somehow. But the Cambrian explosion is a big problem for his theory. Dr. Stephen Meyer's book, Darwin's Doubt, I read that. That also explains that. So some scientists, what they say is, well, look, you don't realize we're talking about billions and billions of years. And so anything could happen over billions of years, right? I mean, it's difficult. Sure, it's hard to figure, but you have billions and billions of years. So anything can happen by time and chance given enough time, right? Somebody said if you chained 1,000,000 or 1,000 gorillas to 1,000 typewriters, and they were, let's say they're eternal gorillas, and they got eternity to type, to pound on the typewriters, surely one of them eventually would type the 23rd Psalm, right? Or something from Shakespeare, right? Well, I'm afraid not, because the problem is when you type like that, you don't type the letters that have to be in order. You type one of the letters that's in the Lord is my shepherd, but then the next letter, instead of an H, you type something else and then type something else. Sure, a person could pick out of there the letters to make the 23rd Psalm, but you see what I'm saying? It's a jumbled mess. That's what chemistry would be like by accident. It never comes together to form the complicated things we see. By the way, so there's this other theory called panspermia now. And even Richard Dawkins said that maybe life came from outer space. Meteorites maybe crashed into our atmosphere, and they contained the basic cells to start life. And so they kind of seeded the Earth from space. Or maybe a comet went by and dropped these things. Or some have even said maybe aliens or an advanced life form flew around the universe scattering life. To me, that's a science of the gaps theory. They always say we believe in the God of the gaps, like things that we can't explain, there must be God who did it. Well, that's not what we do. What we do is we look at all the evidence and say, man, every time you ever see something complicated and that communicates a message, an intelligence created it. So we're not saying God of the gaps, but what I see these people doing is they have a science of the gaps. Well, we can't explain it. We haven't found it yet, but it must be out there. We're going to find it sometime. And so one other thing I'll just mention real quick. Darwin said, that things went from simple to complex, and that, like you all, I'm sure, saw in high school, like the charts where they show these little animals that later became horses. They evolved. Eohippus became a horse. And they say this other little land animal went into the sea and started swimming a lot. And the next thing you know, it evolved into being a whale. Well, if that were the case, you'd actually have a whole lot of transitional animals in between the original one and the final product, right? You should actually have more transitional animals than final product, because it took billions of years and they're evolving, right? These would be called transitional forms. Well, they're just not found. There haven't been any transitional forms found. So that sort of really causes a problem for the theory of evolution. And so the whole theory of evolution is really, one of the main premises of it is that everything came about by undirected, random, accidental accidents, right? An accidental process. It wasn't directed. That's the whole premise of evolution. That's why they wanted it, because there's no God. So to me, I just really, I'm amazed that people who call themselves Christians buy into this, like the Catholic popes and so on. And actually, one whole part of the Presbyterian denomination accepts evolution, and Francis Collins does, and so on. I just think that that's so absurd. Like, what are you thinking? What are you saying? You're saying that God used an undirected process to bring about all the complexities of life, when we read in the Bible how he directs all these different things, and everything is sustained by his powerful word. It couldn't even exist without him continually maintaining it. And you think he did it by this accidental process that took billions of years? It just doesn't make sense. And more than that, guys, what I see is that some guy in one of the videos I watched said this. He said, my father was an engineer, and he told me, son, anytime you see a system, that performs any kind of function, maybe a pump and a system that pumps water to fields or whatever, or maybe you see some kind of a door that opens automatically because there's a light beam, or even a system of how people line up in a bank or in an airport. Whenever you see a system, you know that there was a designer of that system. Systems don't happen, right? Well, everywhere we look, folks, we see systems. We see things with a purpose. Like, for example, the circulatory system. You look at it, you know what it's for. There's a heart, and it pumps this liquid called blood, and it goes through all these vessels. And you can see that they carry nutrients and oxygen and so forth to all the cells. You can see what it does, what it's for. There's a system, and it has a purpose. You see that everywhere. It's called the teleological argument, by the way, because telos is the Greek word for like end or purpose. Whenever you see something that has a purpose and it's for performing a function for something, you know that it was designed by a designer. When you see a carburetor on top of an engine, you don't go, wow, look at that. It formed there and it happens to mix the gas and the air together so the engine can run. No, some engineer said, we got to mix gas and air together. How are we going to do that? And they designed a carburetor. When you look at the eye and how it focuses and opens the pupil wide when it's dark and closes when it's bright, and how it blinks and cleans itself, and how it has tear ducts, and how the lens inside can actually change shape to focus light on the retina, and the retina has all these little cells to send to the brain. When you see that, you know that's designed. And so people that are materialists today, that believe in naturalism, naturalistic materialism, they say, we Christians, oh, you people just believe. Faith is believing things without evidence. But they're just so mistaken. We look at the evidence. If I see some writing in the sand at the beach, we were just at the beach this week. If you see Mary, John loves Mary, scribbled, scratched in the sand at the beach, you don't think, look at that, the waves did that, the sand crabs did that. You know that somebody with a mind did that. We don't believe in stuff without evidence. We look all around and all we see is a mountain, a universe of evidence that shows us that there must be a designer who created all this. We live in a rebellious world, and a lot of people don't want to submit to God. And that's why they like this materialistic, naturalistic theory. But it's a shame, because this God, he made all this for us, and look how beautiful it is. And you can trust him. He's a loving God. He's not a dictator trying to ruin your life. He made you for a purpose. And so it's sad that people want to rebel against God, and they want to look for excuses and ways to escape, so they believe in these kind of theories. It might have sounded plausible when it was first formulated, the theory of evolution. And I'm not saying Darwin himself was doing it to rebel against God. Science is a search for truth. And so we formulate theories, and sometimes they pan out and sometimes they don't. Well, the theory of evolution just simply hasn't panned out. And as we're going along through time here, more and more, even scientists are admitting this. Of course, those of us who trust in the Lord, we understand life is not an accident. Life's a miracle. And God is the author of it. He's the creator of life. Life is beyond our human comprehension. It's beyond our ability to produce. We need to recognize that and, man, teach that to our kids. Instead of, they won't let you teach it in the schools. The devil's controlling all that stuff. But at least teach it to them in your home and show them that there's a reason to reject the scientific theory. We're not against science, but we're against theories that don't pan out and don't offer good enough explanations for things. We have a better explanation for things. And there are many Christian scientists who have been working on this, and they've come up with many ways in which we can refute evolution. I recommend some of the books I showed you a picture of there, and that you would think these things through deeply and be ready to show that there is an alternative. We should refute the lies, and we should proclaim God's truth. In the beginning, the Lord created us. He created life in all its variety, and so forth. I'll close with Psalm 104:24. It says, "How many are your works, O Lord? In wisdom you made them all. The earth is full of your creatures, your creations." Till next time, may the Lord richly bless you.